Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The Conquerors from 1932. And this continues my series where I try to review all of the films of William A. Wellman. The Conquerors was made as kind of a follow-up to Cimarron, which was a huge hit for David O. Selznick, and he wanted a major director to direct The Conquerors to be his big follow-up, and he got a former big epic director, William A. Wellman, who had directed Wings, and so he got him on loan from Warner Brothers to direct this big budget epic that was supposed to be one of the biggest pictures of all time. That didn't work out, but this isn't a bad movie. I don't know Cimarron that well, so this review won't really be coming from the perspective of someone who has. I'm kind of embarrassed I haven't seen it, especially reviewing a film that's kind of essentially an artistic follow-up and was very much made because of the success and how it won Best Picture and everything led David O. Selznick to want to make a film like The Conquerors. I'm going to look at it more from the William Wellman perspective, as I have with most of these Wellman reviews, and in terms of his filmography, but it kind of makes sense that O. Selznick would want William Wellman to direct a big epic. Wellman had brought more budget to the gangster pictures with Public Enemy. He had done one of the biggest epics of all time, and at this time probably still one of the highest grossing films of all time, Wings. Well, in 1932 it was still probably one of the biggest films of all time. He had had some major successes. He knew he could work well with actors and get it on time and be a good studio director, and so it made kind of a lot of sense, and Wellman works very well with this film. And Wellman's sensibilities work well with both showing a very sentimental side, but also showing how time will eventually rip that apart. And that works very well for an epic that spans a long period of time like this film does. I think a lot of times with Wellman, his sensibilities and the time period and both the subject matter can work incredibly well. And I think Conquerors is another example of that. It takes place from about 1873 to 1931. That span of time is really a span of time that people were very much interested in at the time. You still had grandparents telling their kids about that time period, telling them about the previous financial collapses, which I didn't even know about as much before watching this film, but it was certainly something of interest, that recent history. Wellman shows it through that interest, through that time period's look into the past, much like how we look into the 70s and 60s and the 50s today is how they would look at it through this film, and you kind of can see that nostalgic interest in it, but also being able to take a look back and really show the time period for what it was and what it would lead to be. Something that really works for Wellman. If you look at all his big epics, he understands what time means, and I think that's one of the more important things for making a big epic and why his sensibilities work really well, and why this is more than just the financial failure follow-up to a much more well-known movie. A young couple played by Richard Dix and Anne Harding, who, as the film starts out in the 1870s, and he is a banker for her father's bank, just kind of a lonely banker who's very much in love with her, and as the film starts off we just see them hanging out together, and she gets in trouble for being alone with a man. He sees them together and says he shouldn't come around again, he's banned from coming around, but then when the financial collapse happens in the 1870s, suddenly her father dies from the stress of what happened, and Richard Dix's character is out of a job, and now that Richard Dix and Anne Harding are married, what's a young couple to do without any money? And they decide to go west, and most of her family's possessions are sold off, and they get in a boat and start going west until bandits come and rob them and shoot him, and he is carried on by a very annoying comic relief drunk doctor who does actually save his life as he recuperates in this hotel run by this very nice woman who's also kind of a sidekicky comic relief character in the film. And then after he rallies the troops to go after this gang, after they keep invading this town and keep attacking them, he rallies the troops. He's about to go with them, but he's still recovering from his injuries and falls off his horse, and they go do it. But then him and his wife decide, after they've taken out these bandits, after a really graphic hanging scene, which is kind of interesting from the guy who would later make Oxbow Incident, to make a pro hanging scene and a pro mob mentality scene. They were the actual people who did it, unlike, spoilers, the Oxbow Incident. He starts a bank, and the bank becomes a big banking dynasty and helps build up the town, and it eventually gets the railroad to come to town as they have twin children. And after that, the film starts skipping time periods. It keeps being more episodic, and you see the kids grown up a little bit, you see the railroad come to town, you see another financial collapse, you see various other things happen, and then they move past that, and then you see a grandson being born. Then they move forward to the grandson being in World War I, who is also played by Richard Dix, all the way up to what was at that time the present day at the beginning of the Depression. One of the things that The Conquerors has in common with another William Wellman film that had been released a couple months earlier, So Big, is that it takes an epic kind of a story and puts it into 86 minutes. I've heard rumors of So Big, there were more rumors that there were parts cut out, and everyone kind of assumes there were parts cut out of this film. This film's a little distinct about what it's doing, so it doesn't feel like why would they have all this extra information? That feels a little silly. All the shots and all the movements, it feels like it is actually more made to be an epic in 86 minutes more than So Big. I don't know if I like this film more than So Big necessarily, but it does feel like it's more to the point in its epicness under that time. And I think when you think of an epic now, you think of something like Gone with the Wind, you think of something that would be 3 hours long to take in all this time and all this history. And The Conquerors does that very, very quickly. And I think Wellman's actually pretty good at it. It's interesting that this film came out after So Big, because it feels like someone who almost understands how to do that a little better than he did with So Big. So Big is kind of like 2 parts, whereas Conquerors gets more episodic in what it's trying to do and cover all this time period. The thing about The Conquerors is I didn't know about all these financial collapses, but I'm going to remember all these financial collapses because I learned the human side of it. And I like that about The Conquerors because it makes me think about all the time that changed throughout that era. It shows how finances changed and how America became what it was from the 19th century to the 20th century, how the Industrial Revolution changed within that time, how society changed, how technology changed, and also showing how social mores changed but also stayed the same. But it does have a very enjoyable watchability to it that I love about this period, and I love about both classic Hollywood and going through pre-code. It feels like it can, certainly with the hanging scene, but there's other scenes like a suicide that really show the rawness of these periods. It still has its aw shucks swellness to it, but it doesn't hold back. And that's another thing I like about Wellman, is he can be sentimental. He can show this couple kissing on the riverboat, but he almost like doesn't let a second go by to when the bandits come and shoot him and steal all their shit. That's William Wellman to me. It's like he can be sentimental. Here's the stakes. Here's what this person cares about. Oh, and now I'm going to shoot them. I love that instantaneous quality to him. He almost, in the 30s, feels a little more like impatient in his storytelling. He feels like he wants to get to the meat immediately. That might have also been the runtime and just the time period, but I noticed his storytelling's a lot quicker. I know he didn't write this film. This was written by the same guy who wrote Cimarron. He was a good studio director. He directed all sorts of kinds of pictures at this time, but I think The Conqueror shows more of a mastery to his epicness than So Big did, really, because you really get the sense of time. You really understand what's going on throughout it. I think So Big is just 2 parts, and you kind of get that. The story's more about that time difference, whereas Conquerors is about the passage of all that time and showing it. And also, Wellman as a technical director is more on display in this film. Particularly, Richard Dix plays both the main character of the couple, who eventually becomes the grandfather, and actually the grandson, sometimes in the same shot, and it doesn't look so bad, I have to say. I was actually kind of surprised how good it looked. They do the kind of the similar thing where you have the same actor playing 2 roles in the same shot and they cut a little too early. It like feels almost unnatural, the editing. I mean, there's one time they try to do a handshake. It's almost like, oh, okay, he's dealing with like a projection behind him that they shot earlier. Okay, I get it. I thought Richard Dix actually had good chemistry with himself, and I actually thought it worked fairly well, you know. I mean, I was kind of shocked when you see the grandson. You're like, what? Like, I didn't know we could do this then, or as well as they could. And Wellman also does a nice little segment that's kind of a tribute to silent filmmaking with George Méliès and some newsreels and things like that. And I've never really seen a Wellman film where he gives tribute to the movies before. So I like that sequence, and it gave you kind of the excitement. You had this little boy getting excited about the movies, and it was kind of interesting. It was like, oh wow, you do actually like movies, don't you? You see that from a lot of filmmakers nowadays, but this is the only thing I can think of in a Wellman film where he really pays tribute to the movies in any way. And I kind of like that he put that in. It didn't even really have much to do with the characters. Maybe Selznick forced him to, maybe RKO was like, you should do this. But now, one of the best parts of this movie is there's these transitions showing the economic growth and the economic fall in these various times, and these montages were almost like a silent film itself, and it reminded me of the experimentation that Wellman used to do in his silent era films and how good he was at silent filmmaking. And then afterwards I noticed it was Slavonko Vorkapich, I think that's how you say his name, and he was an experimental filmmaker who was also very famous for making montages in Hollywood films, and those are probably my my favorite part of this movie. They are so well done. They have an experimental quality to them, particularly the part about the 1929 financial collapse is particularly strange and weird and very experimental, but it still is telling the story. That's one of the cooler things about these montages is they get a little weird, they get a little strange, but kind of in that strange way that Hollywood auteurs kind of did then. If you're going to be strange, you kind of sneak it in there with the storytelling, and in a way that's a lot more creative. They give you a sense of how each of those is different and how each of those times were different, how money was different, how money was handled in each of those different times. They do have scenes after that where you can definitely see that, but showing it visually, you got a real sense of that. Slavenko Vorkapich, I think, worked really well with Wellman's sensibilities, to the fact that I've seen this many Wellman films and I actually thought Wellman had done it. I don't know if he had anything to do with these sections, or Wellman was making so many movies at this time. I wouldn't be surprised if he just did the scenes he was supposed to do and left, and this guy just made the montages, but they complement each other so well. You'd think they're made by the same director in a way. They do actually kind of stand out, and I was just kind of blown away by how good they were. I was like, wow, this is just exceptional. I like a lot of the acting in it, particularly Richard Dix is very, very good in this, and Anne Harding as well. Richard Dix and Anne Harding, I think, are really the core of the film, and their relationship is clearly the thing that builds all of this. They really get you in very early on in the film, and you kind of fall in love with these characters because they're both honorable and spirited, but you can kind of see how they are flawed. So later on, you're with them as characters as you go through these episodic vignettes. You have this big section at the beginning, and then it gets episodic, and that might feel weird. It's smart because, well, let's build a relationship with the audience and then put them through like 50 years. Because like you're not going to want to go through 50 years until you know them, until you're with them. Knowing them makes it feel that much more personal. It makes you feel like you're going through that time with them, and that's an important part of why The Conquerors work. I like these kind of epics. I like Hollywood at this time. I like a good pre-code epic. Of the Wellman films that are particularly hard to find, I'm kind of surprised this one is as hard to find. It's a good epic through the ages, and I actually feel like I learned something about America. There are some hammy moments, particularly at the end, and they kind of don't handle the Depression that well. It's kind of a weird thing where you understand the disposability of some of these financial crashes and how we're going to go past them and how America got better and better throughout it. And at the end, it's kind of like does a similar thing to Heroes for Sale, where it's like, oh no, we're going to get so much better. It almost feels disingenuous to the spirit of the movie and what it's saying and how time passes and how things evolve. It's like kind of an unnatural stasis to it because this film just keeps moving and moving and moving, but eventually time has to stop and we all have to die. So I guess that's kind of like what's going on in The Conquerors, and it kind of makes you remark at the time period, much like people would at the time and much how we would at movies that are talking about the times that led up to where we are now. This film is that to the time in 1932, and I think it does that very well, and Wellman knows how to do that because Wellman is both sentimental and knows how that sentimentality is eventually going to wither away and die, and the reasons for that with the time period. I think that really works for an epic. It makes it more interesting, and it kind of involves you a little more because you're like, wow, that time period was actually kind of rough. How did they get past this time? And it involved me more. It made me think about great films I've seen about American history or any history that were made in Hollywood and how that got me into it and got me to learn about that, but also how much I cared about those characters. And I almost think about those characters as much as the history, and I think that shows how good William Wellman was as a storyteller, because he knew he wanted to tell you what happened at this time, but he also wanted you to care and care about these characters based on these great performances by Richard Dix and Anne Harding, and all of that really came together to make a really remarkable motion picture, what was supposed to be one of the biggest movies of all time, but ultimately wasn't. So if you have seen The Conquerors and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. Check out my William Wellman review playlist. It will have an annotation below. I have reviewed over 50 William Wellman films, so if you're a fan of William Wellman, you should click on that annotation. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.